Welcome back to the second part of the lecture on ancient Egypt. Let's turn now to the Old Kingdom, which is known as the Great Age of the Pyramids. These were when the large pyramids were built. The three largest are in the Giza Plateau, right outside modern-day Cairo. In fact, Cairo is such a large, sprawling city that from the pyramids you can see the edge of Cairo. And as I mentioned earlier, these three pyramids were built when the Nile was flooded in the summer and the farmers couldn't work in the fields, so they were given bread for themselves and their families for working on the pyramids. They were also considered to be very loyal to the pharaoh. And the pyramid, of course, was the funerary monument for the pharaoh. There is a video in the module on the possible construction process. And I emphasize the word possible because no one really knows how these huge pyramids were built, how they got the stones up. And the stones had to be transported to the pyramids. And then how did they get them up? The equivalent of a 45-story building. The most prevalent theory is, and again, there's no actual proof for this, believe it or not, with all the writings we have from the Egyptians and sculpture, we don't have anything on the engineering of the pyramids. But as shown in the movie, the thought was they built ramps around the pyramid as it was being built, and workers pulled sleds with the large stones. And they didn't use wheels on these sleds. They had wheels. We know their chariots had wheels, but they were just sledges and hard dirt, and someone poured water from buckets in front of the sledge to reduce the friction and pulled the blocks up. There are over 2 million, yes, 2 million blocks in the largest pyramid. Each block weighs about as much as a small car. Here's a photo of your fearless professor about 10 years ago out. I was visiting a friend who's an archaeologist there with the three largest pyramids, the so-called Giza pyramids. And you can see the largest one, the one in the center there, the top of it still has the original limestone casing. Those used to go down the entire pyramids. They were polished very, very fine, and so when the idea with the sun reflecting, they would just be beautiful. Excuse me. But over the centuries, that limestone was stolen by people who wanted to use it for building other constructions. Now these pyramids, the largest ones, are as high as a 45-story building. That's huge. And they're 750 feet long at each side. As I mentioned, the largest one has 2 million blocks. These blocks were cut by hand and hauled by hand to the construction site. Part of them were floated down the Nile, but others were by hand. And they were actually the highest man-made objects in the world until the Eiffel Tower was constructed in Paris in 1989. This is a cross-section view of the largest of the pyramids, and you can see the Grand Gallery, and then the king's burial chamber was buried right in the center of it. So you can see on the right side of it was the entrance, the formal entrance. You would go down, and then the tunnel goes way down underground, but that was never finished, and it's not clear whether that was originally going to be the chamber to bury the king, or this was built to confuse grave robbers. And because there were grave robbers of the ancient burials at Saqqara, and there was great concern that the pharaoh's body itself be stolen, but also all the objects that were buried with him for use in his afterlife. And so the way you could go in now as a tourist is you go in on the right there, and then you go up, you go through the Grand Gallery, and then you can see the King's Chamber, and then near that is the Queen's Chamber. And from the King's Chamber you can see lines going both left and right. Those are small air shafts, not to bring air in, but that's to allow the king's body and soul to escape for the afterlife. There's a similar one from the Queen's Chamber. After the king is the pharaoh. After the pharaoh was buried, workers filled in all of the tunnels with rocks, large slabs of granite, and then some of the workers who knew the exact location of the burial chamber were killed and buried inside to prevent them from telling people. But within several hundred years, grave robbers had managed to get in and steal everything. And actually, they didn't go in sort of the quote official entrance. They went in nearby, and they knew they needed to get to the center of the pyramid, so they just kept going, and they ended up hitting one of the tunnels. And I remember when I went in, the first time I went in, I was a bit terrified. You're in the middle of a huge structure, and then I remember the guide said, "Well, don't be so egotistical. This has been here for 4,000 years. Don't think it's all going to fall down just because you're inside." Still, I must say I was a little relieved to get outside. Now, right next to the largest pyramid, which was built for the pharaoh Khafre, which we see there on the right, the one that still has some of the limestone casing at the top, we have the famous Sphinx. And there is the Sphinx, which is part of that funerary complex. And it was believed that it was created as the guardian for Khafre's tomb. The head of it may well be a stylized portrait of the pharaoh. It's not entirely known. When this was first really discovered about 250, 300 years ago, it was buried in sand, and only part of the head was sticking out. So the French at that time controlled Egypt, and they removed much of the sand, and they didn't really value it for its architectural importance, and they started using it for target practice with their artillery. It's interesting, the Sphinx is not built with blocks like the pyramids. It was a natural little mountain there, so it's a natural formation that was carved to look like a lion with the paws in front of it and the head of a human, and it's believed to be the pharaoh Khafre. I just said that. Now, this Sphinx of Khafre is quite different from other sphinxes in Egypt, because the Khafre Sphinx has a human face and an animal body, and this is similar to the Sphinx in Greece. The lion forms the body of the Khafre Sphinx because the lion for the Egyptians was by far the most powerful animal in nature. And if you look at the orientation of the Sphinx, it lines up exactly east-west with the pyramid, and that's to help Khafre's body and soul make the journey at the end of the day to the sun god Ra. Now let's look briefly at some other Egyptian Sphinx. Now, all of these have animal heads with animal or human bodies. None have human heads. You recall the Sphinx for the pharaoh Khafre had a human face. One of the most there are many of these, but one of the most important is Heket, and she was the goddess of childbirth and fertility. She was portrayed as a human body with the head of a frog, Now you might ask, why a frog? Well, there are many, many frogs in Egypt, and frogs have many offspring called tadpoles. Particularly when the Nile floods, the waters go out in the farmers' fields, and when the waters recede, there are many, many millions of tadpoles there, baby frogs. So people in ancient times associated the frog with fertility. In fact, the image of the tadpole, the hieroglyphic of it, is the largest single number of 100,000. So this is a carving of Hecate, and you can see a human body with a frog's head. And these are some of the numbers in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And on the far right, you can see a tadpole, which means 100,000. And this is sort of a modern illustration of Hecate with a frog head and a human body. Another important god was Khepre, who was the creator god. And here you can see from a tomb painting a human body, but the head of a beetle. Why would they choose the head of a beetle? Well, beetles, or many beetles, lay their eggs in dung balls, animal feces, and then many weeks or months later, the babies are born, they eat the dung as their food, and then they emerge, apparently from nothing. So for the Egyptians, it was as if the beetles were created out of nothing. So again, this is a modern depiction of that. I mentioned last lecture the most important of the gods, which is the sun god Ra, also known as Amun-Ra, which is a combination of two early gods. And this god is by far the most important of the many gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Now, Amun created the universe, and Ra was the god of sun and light. And they were eventually combined into the one all-powerful god, Amun-Ra. And here you have, from an early parchment, the god. Now, the temple of Karnak along the Nile River is dedicated to the sun god. And it's about 1 mile from Luxor. And Luxor is where the pharaoh would go to pray. Now, between them, about a mile distance, was an avenue which has 1,300 Sphinx to guard the avenue. And that's when once a year there's a ceremony where they carry a statue of the all-important Amun-Ra god down that avenue to Luxor, where the pharaoh makes a sacrifice and receives the god's blessing to rule for 1 more year. So this is done every year. And this is so important because every pharaoh is considered the son of a Ra god. So they must go through this ceremony. This is a photo of the over 1,000 sphinxes along the 1 mile avenue. And you can see they have the head of a ram, which is a powerful animal. Now we'll skip over the Middle Kingdom. You can read a little about it in the textbook. So we'll go directly from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, in which you have greatly increased wealth. You have great political stability, and Egypt starts expanding in the region, particularly along the Mediterranean Sea. And we no longer have we no longer have pyramids built as mortuaries or for funerals for the pharaohs. The pharaohs are now buried across the Nile River it's called the Valley of the Kings, which was a very desolate area, and it was thought that grave robbers could never find them there because the pharaohs were quite concerned, knowing that if you build a huge pyramid, the grave robbers will go there and build tunnels, knowing that there'll be great riches inside. So they went to what they thought was totally inaccessible area, and they built their tombs there. Now, also, um, some of them built large temples, what they called mortuary temples, where you would go and worship the pharaohs and gods while they were alive, and then serve as their tombs. This is an example of, there were a couple female pharaohs. By far the most well-known was Hatshepsut, and this is near the Nile. And you want to see how large it is, you can look down there and you can see some people. So this is huge. It's actually cut into the rocks. And Egyptian parchment writings show many, many hundreds of large potted plants, or ferns and little palm trees, which were planted there. And then slaves were sent to the river to bring buckets of water to irrigate them. So it must have been quite splendid in its heyday. Well, when we want to look at the daily life of people, that's often very, very difficult, because particularly at this time, until fairly modern times, most people could not read or write, so they weren't going to leave any sort of written record. And historians are often asking, well, this is fine about the pharaohs and others, but how did the average person live? Well, and we're talking about 98%, 99% of the people. It's very difficult to get a handle on that. We do know that the Egyptians developed beer as a means to store grains, and so beer was one of their main sources of food. Now, it wasn't very strong beer in terms of alcoholic content, but the beer was designed to store grains. Why is that? Well, if you take the grains, wheat and other grains, when it's fresh, you can make bread, but you can't keep bread very long. They obviously didn't have freezers. The bread rots or is eaten by rats. The grain itself will rot away or be eaten by rats. So by making beer lasts a long time because of the alcoholic content. It actually purifies the water. And so the beer became a main source of food for them. In fact, if you look at the Egyptian hieroglyphic for food, it's a combination of two other hieroglyphics next to each other. One is the hieroglyphic for grain, the other is the hieroglyphic for beer. We know that the main food item for the vast majority of the people was bread. The Nile has lots of fish, so people of all classes did supplement their diet with fish, which of course is a great source of protein. But their main food item was bread. It was the flour, the wheat was ground on rough stones. So as a result, the flour had little bits of sand in it from the grinding process. And that, of course, stayed in the bread. So, if you're chewing this bread 3-4 times a day, it eventually grinds down the teeth. And you can see this in the mummies, where virtually all of them have really badly ground down molars. And if they got too bad, you find many, many skeletons that have the teeth badly decayed or removed. Now, in southern Egypt, you have the famous temple of Ramses II, one of the greatest pharaohs. It's at Abu Simbel. And what is of interest here is how the world came together to save this temple. This is the side of a cliff that leads down to the Nile River below. And this is up high on the cliff. These figures are about 65 feet tall. That's about as tall as a 5 or 6 story building. And they weren't made of blocks, but they were just, this all was carved. And then you see the door there where the door is, it goes in about 150 or 200 feet, and I'll show you some photos in a minute of a beautiful temple in there. This is for Ramses II. His wife's temple is not in this photo, but it's right next to it. And as I mentioned, this is climbed in the cliff wall. Here's a photo with, I selected a photo with some people because that gives you an idea of the scale here. You can see the people, assume they're around 6 feet. You can see actually how large this is. Now this is going into the cliff. You can see, again, the scale. Look on the lower left. You can see a man with a blue shirt and white pants. Look at how small he is compared to the statues. And this goes in quite a ways. Right next to him was the temple of Nefertiti, and again, you want to see the scale. You look in the door. If you look carefully, you can see a person sitting down, to check your ticket. So these are absolutely huge. And this is a famous bust of Ramses II's wife, Nefertiti. Some believe that for a number of years after his death, she was actually a pharaoh herself. Well, what was the problem with this tomb? As I mentioned, it's on the side of a cliff, the original one, and, fairly high above the Nile. Then in an area in southern Egypt where the Nile and its annual flooding really didn't flood it out. But in the 1960s, the Egyptian government wanted to build a dam on the Nile, and it wanted to build a dam for two purposes. Well, one was to produce electricity, as dams are, once they're constructed, a very inexpensive way to produce massive amounts of electricity. The other was to provide irrigation and at the same time control flooding, because the Nile, as I mentioned, first part of the lecture, like clockwork, every summer it floods, tremendous floods. And as cities were moving nearer the Nile, people said, well, we need to control nature here, so we're going to build a dam. The problem is, remember the Nile flows from south to north. The dam was going to be on the northern side of these two wonderful temples. And the result of building the dam is, of course, behind the dam, you have a lake. The water goes up, and the water was calculated that it would go up and totally flood these dams. Well, there was an outcry by the international community, and the Egyptian government was relying on loans from international organizations such as the World Bank to help fund this dam. Everybody thought the dam was a good idea, but they didn't want to destroy these temples. So great pressure was put on the Egyptian government, which resisted, because the Egyptian government said, well, it's our country, we can do what we want with our ruins. And international organizations such as the World Bank said, no, these temples are sort of part of humanity. They're very important. And the Egyptian government said, oh, it's all you wealthy Europeans and Americans like to come see, but you don't care if our people are starving. Well, there's a big controversy. So finally, the international community agreed to move these two temples above the new lake so they'd be preserved, and that's where they are today. So the United Nations, through its member governments, actually pay. The United Nations has no money. Member governments like the United States, which you may or may not know, the United States pays 23% of the funding of the United Nations in general. Companies paid, many companies paid tens of millions of dollars to help move these temples, and they produced advertisements on TV and newspapers saying, look at us, IBM, etc. We helped many European companies. And it took 4 years to move the temples. And then after that 4-year delay, the Egyptian government was allowed to build the dam. So, well, now the problem is, how do you move these temples? This is fascinating. Well, first of all, above the dam was flat desert, above the river rather. So first they had to build 2 mountains to put the temples in. That's the next slide. So here we have the dam is completed, the waters come up, and under the water is where the 2 temples were. So the temples, we'll show you how they're moved in a minute. They were cut into blocks and moved. But these like little mountains were built so they could put the temples on the front, because remember, the temples have interiors that go in. So these were built of of rocks and stone. Some of it is actually open inside, but it was a major, major construction project just to move them. You couldn't just put the temple there on flat ground. So I think you're beginning to see what a major effort this was. So they built those. Then they had to take the monuments and move them up away from the cliff and into those fake mountains, or new mountains. Well, the monuments were not blocks. They were carved out of solid rock. So they had to go in with saws, special rock saws, cut them into blocks. They had to number each one on the back. It was like a big puzzle. And then they had to put it all back together. So here we're seeing them putting this back together up on the top. This is before they built all of the fake mountain. And you can see the people there, how large this is. To me, it's kind of scary. You see on the right there, the crane lowering the large head, and you see 4 or 5 people standing under it. Could you imagine if that cable slipped? Oh my God, that rock probably weighs 10 times what a car weighs. But anyway, it proceeded. You could just see how big this was. And you can go visit this now. They're the same actual monuments. If you look carefully, you can see where they kind of glued them back together. And then Egypt got its lake. So this is a good example, I think, of the world coming together and saying, yeah, these are important. They're not just a bunch of old rocks. And for humanity, the ancient Egyptians, we need to preserve their heritage. Excuse me. Lastly, I'd like to look at famous King Tut. His formal name is King Tutankhamun, but that's rather complicated, so everybody calls him King Tut. You've probably seen this somewhere. This is the death mask. This was placed over his mask, the head of his mummy, when he was placed in a coffin or sarcophagus. Now, why is King Tut so famous? Well, he's not really famous because he was powerful. He died at around the age 18 unexpectedly. Well, how do we know his age? Well, they've taken his mummy and done CAT scans and MRIs, and doctors have looked at those, and they said they could tell by the formation of the bones and whatnot his age. They can get his age down to within 6 months. They think it's unexpected because he was very young. He was very young, and he hadn't had time to plan a tomb. Normally what a pharaoh would do was, when they were a teenager, they would start working with architects to plan their tomb. And at this time, they were building tombs in the Valley of the Kings. So they'd excavate big rooms, and they'd do the wall decorations, and they'd have it all nicely decorated. So when the pharaoh died, everything was in place. Well, here, he died unexpectedly, so they hadn't even started his tomb. So they're not almost 100% sure how he died. They've done lots of analysis of his mummy, again, using modern radiology, CAT scans, and MRIs. And if you're interested in it, There are lots of documentaries available on YouTube or Netflix or Amazon Prime on this. You can actually see them doing all this analysis. And they say, well, he clearly broke his leg because they can see the bone was broken, but they can also see that he didn't just die, break his leg, and bleed to death or something, because the bone had started healing. And they can see this on the x-rays or MRIs, forgotten where, because they could see the healing process. So the question is, well, if he broke his leg, why did he die? The thought was he used to love riding his chariot. He fell off his chariot, which would be easy to do, and broke his leg, and with a bad fracture called a compound fracture, where one of the bits of bone goes through the surface, through the skin rather, you could get an infection, and particularly with the dirt and bacteria, and they had no antibiotics in those days. So the speculation is he died of an infection following a broken leg. Now, he was, again, buried in the Valley of the Kings. His burial chamber is very small. You can go visit it. It's only about 900 square feet. That's about the size of a typical classroom, about 30 feet by 30 feet. And normal is very, very small for a pharaoh. Even though he was a young pharaoh, he was a pharaoh. Other pharaohs have much larger and more elaborate decoration. And so no one knows, but the thought is that there was a tomb being built for a nobleman or a noble lady. The pharaoh died. And again, remember the Book of the Dead. The person must be mummified, and the burial must take place within 70 days. And so they didn't have time to build a big tomb. So they went in, found one already carved out. They went in and quickly painted the walls with some scenes from the Book of the Dead. And if you look at the scenes, they're not very elaborately painted. They're not nearly as elaborate as in other tombs. Art historians have analyzed the brush strokes and said it was done rather quickly. And of great significance is the fact that it's the only royal tomb where you can see mold in the paint. There are little blotches of mold on the walls, and that's because they had to move quickly. They painted the tomb, and they didn't leave the entrance open for months and months and months for the dry desert air to come in and dry the paint. So when they buried King Tut, they closed the door, sealed it, and put rock there and everything to keep out the robbers. And so the paint was still a little moist, and so mold grew. But I put in red here, what's really important is it's the only closed royal tomb ever found. Every other royal tomb that have been found for all the pharaohs, whether it's in the big pyramids, the early versions of pyramids, the Mustafas that look like wedding cakes, or in the Valley of Kings where there are many pharaohs, every one of those tombs had been broken into by grave robbers fairly soon after death, within dozens or 100, 200 years. And many times the bodies had been stolen, or they'd find the mummy, but unwrapped because people were looking for precious objects. This one had never been found, and that's what made it so world famous and of such significance. Now, it was found fairly recently in 1922. Howard Carter, an English archaeologist, finally located the tomb. There's a video in the module, which is interesting. He had looked and looked for years, and he was paid by a famous wealthy archaeologist in London, in England, he said, well, this is your last year, it's costing too much. And so he looked, Howard Carter said, well, let me look where no one else has looked, under these huts. And the huts were, ruins of where the workmen lived who actually built the tombs. And, through good luck, they found the stairwell and they opened this. So King Tut instantly became world famous. Here is the actual tomb, untouched, with um, with all the objects that were buried, the precious objects of gold, his chariots, everything was there. And this led to what was called Egyptomania. People became, and still are, fanatical about Egypt. Wow, people from all over the U.S. and Europe flocked to see the tomb, and people became more and more interested in Egypt itself. The module has a video. It's like a 5-minute video with actual videos from 1922 showing Howard Carter moving away the rock and actually finding the tomb. People have talked about the curse of King Tut and other pharaohs, but particularly King Tut, because outside the door in hieroglyphics, it said that, and it had his cartouche or the sign of King Tut, King Tutankhamun, and it said anyone who molests this tomb will be cursed with death or whatever. Well, Howard Carter went in and he died a few years later. His patron from England went in the same day with him, and he died, and a number of people have died, and so there's a lot of talk about whether there's a curse or not. Well, whether there's a curse or not, here I am at the tomb of Tutankhamun. One student said, "Professor, all I need is a black whip and I look like Indiana Jones." For those of you who have seen Indiana Jones movie, you could appreciate that joke. But you can see here in the back, it's just desert, just total desert. This is the entrance into the tomb. This is on a hot August day. The temperature was 118 degrees, incredibly hot. Normally, if you go in the winter time, you'd wait 4 or 5 hours to get in because it's very small and there are long lines of tourists from the US, Europe, Japan, you name it. But nobody in their right mind, except me, went there in August. I went with an archaeologist friend who showed me around. So there's the tomb. There's not much to see in it because all the gold and whatnot has been taken out and put in the, I'll show a few photos of it in a minute, museum in Cairo. But you still have the wall paintings, and it's kind of neat to go there. Well, when it was found, it was like almost like when an astronaut landed on the moon in 1969. Headlines around the world. I just pulled this one up off the internet. This is the newspaper from Ogden, Utah, of all places. Pharaoh's tomb opened, This is one of the early black and white photos inside. Even though the tomb is very small, it has a number of little chambers, and these were guards, and behind that was a door they opened, and that's where they found actually the mummy. Also, there were many, many artifacts belonging to King Tut. Here he had several chariots that were disassembled. Some of the objects, this is an original black and white photo from Howard Carter, but later, but color photos, which were taken by other people who arrived, showed much of the bright gold and just how beautiful it was. Apparently, someone had tried to get in the tomb, but they had been scared off or something, but no one ever really had got in. So it was untouched royal tomb. And all these objects are obviously, for Tut's afterlife. He needed physical objects like his chariot. He had a number of walking sticks, maybe 40 or 50 walking sticks. Some were the royal pharaonic walking sticks. Others, people thought, well, maybe he had a bad leg all his life. There were all sorts of things for his afterlife, even his pillow. And this is what you can see in Cairo. You can go and there are a series of coffins, one inside the other. And this you can see the death mask on it. The Egyptian government used to allow this to go on international tour. It actually came to Houston like 20 or 30 years ago. And I wasn't living here, but I understand the lines were like 5 hours to wait to get in. Uh, but now the Egyptian government won't allow any of this to go on international tour as sort of bargaining with museums around the world to return everything to Egypt, the Rosetta Stone, but other objects that are in New York or Paris or other museums. And they said we're not going to send our objects on tour until we get everything back here. And they've just last year or the year before opened a beautiful, huge museum in Cairo, and much of it is for the first time going to display the 4,000 or 5,000 objects they found in King Tut's tomb, as well as many, many other items. And again, this is part of the Egyptian government's argument. We have a state-of-the-art, brand new museum that's got adequate fire protection and theft protection and everything else. So please send us back everything that has been stolen from our country. Okay, well, thank you very much.